Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled. Mitzvah Hashem. Today we will be learning the Hafresh Tez Zayin Amid Beis, beginning a new Siman Shimon Samach Beis. Eze Mechitza Kruya Mechitza L'Taltel. What kind of mechitzais are considered valid mechitzais so that one can be metaltel, one can move things more than Daled Amas within the enclosure formed by those mechitzais, uba yud beis seifim, and here we have 12 seifim. Our learning should be a schos for achenu kabeis Yisrael hanasunu batzara bashivya ha'im debein bayom ubein bayabasha hamakayim yerachim alehem v'yitzia mitzara l'rvacha me'afela la'ira mishibur l'gu'ula hashta bagala v'zman kariv and amar amen. Our learning should be a schos refuah shalema for Meiri v'Rabbi Reb Shalom Ruven ben Shima, for Achia Gadol ben Shemer ben Esther Fradel, for Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bashir Leah, Chava Hadassah bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, and Gila Shifra bas Ilana Udal. They should all have a refuah shalema b'Sarshar Chayle Yisrael. Says the Mechaber here, Reish Tezayin Amid Beis, Sif Aleph. Kol mechitza shalai nasis lodor b'saycha. Any mechitza that was not erected for residential purposes. This wall was not put up to enclose a residence. It wasn't there for dira. Ella litznius. It was only put there to provide some level of privacy. And let's go right away to the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says Ella litznius. Kigoin, for example, mechitza she'oisen lanuach sham l'shah. Mechitza that was erected so somebody could have a little private place to rest behind it, like chaytzev avonim, people who are quarrying stones. So people are working outside in the stone quarry. They need to be able to take a little bit of a siesta in the afternoon, so they put up some kind of partition so they have a quiet place to go rest. V'habanoim, or similarly construction workers. Or maybe they erected a little dining area where they could don't have to sit there eating in front of everybody. They could put up a little partition that they could have some snius, they could have some privacy and eat behind that partition. This is not there to provide a shelter for residents. It's not what it is. We just need some privacy. Ela mechitzas atznius. So now back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said, Kol mechitza shalinasis lodor b'soicha, mechitza that was erected not for dira purposes, elo litznius, only to provide some privacy. Oy lishmar mashayitnu b'soicha, or some partitions were put up, again, not for dira, but to create a storage area. Oy leishev ba, or somebody put up mechitzais as a little bit of a shelter, but for the purposes of staying in there for a short time period, kidei lishmar asadois, somebody put up a guard booth so that you have to stay there to watch the sadeh, to change away animals or to chase away thieves, but you need some kind of rudimentary shelter, so you put up a guard booth. So says the Mechaber, in any of these cases, hi mechitza l'taltal masha b'seicha, it is an effective mechitza, and it will create an area that's a reshus hayachid, and then you are allowed to be metaltal yosim Daled Amas within that enclosure. Aval eina mechitza lasais masha b'seicha mukaf ledira. But, and we learned a lot of these halachas previously, while it is an effective mechitza, and midaraisa it does make the enclosed area into a reshus hayachid, we have to remember that enclosure is not hukaf ledira. It's not enclosed for residential purposes, and therefore you can't be metaltal yoser b'Daled Amas imhu yoser mi beis sasayim. So yes, you would close an area to be a guard booth, you would close an area to be a little resting area, a little storage area. Yeah, it's a reshus hayachid midaraisa, you're allowed to be metaltal yoser b'Daled Amas inside that enclosure. But once you enclose such an area that's larger than a Beis Sasayim, larger than 5,000 square amas, now you have an area that's mukaf bechitzais, but it's not mukaf l'shem dira. And since it's not mukaf l'shem dira, you're restricted. Once you go over 5,000 square amas, it becomes a carmelis. You're not allowed to be metaltal yoser b'Daled Amas inside that enclosure. Now let's break here. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. We did Mishnah Berurah's cut in Aleph, Mishnah Berurah's cut in Beis. Lishmar masha b'seicha. If you put up some partitions as a little storage area to protect what you're going to put inside it. Sha'asuya laniach sham peros. Maybe you erected some partitions around an area that you're going to store produce in. The kalim, or let's say in the case of the construction workers, they made a little enclosure that they could store their tools in. The kayotzeben, or any such similar area. Va'ayin be'biur halacha, and he tells us to take a look at the biur halacha, and we're going to see a fascinating biur halacha in a moment. Let's move on to Mishnah Berurah's cut in Gimel. He mechitza l'taltal. These mechitzas are effective to create a rishos hayachid where you're allowed to be metaltal yosim medalanamis inside that enclosure. Ritzana loymar shayidei hekef hamechitza. By virtue of this enclosure, mutal l'taltal b'chol toich shetach hamechitza. You're allowed to carry inside the whole area of that enclosure imeineno yosim beis hasayim, so long as you do not exceed the size of a beis hasayim. Umashakasav hilkach ilan, what the Mechaber is about to write, therefore, in the case of a tree, kavanasei amashe siyam l'b'saif av yosim beis hasayim. Once you have an area that's larger than a beis hasayim, if it's hukaf, it has mechitzos, but it's not hukaf ledira, then you're not allowed to carry. Now, one of the examples that the Mechaber just gave us was an area that you were mukaf mechitzos lishmar mashe yitnu b'seicha, in order to protect items that you're going to keep inside that enclosure. And the Mishnah Berurah said, like, you made an area where you're going to put peiros, you're going to keep produce in that enclosure, or kalim. You created an area and you were mukaf mechitzos where you're going to keep tools, you're going to keep kalim, whatever it is. Well, that's not called hukaf ledira. And since it's not called hukaf ledira, if you exceed beis hasayim, you're not allowed to be metaltal inside that area. Let's take a look here at a very interesting biur halacha. Biur halacha dibra maschel oilishmar masha yitnu b'seicha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, in Mishnah Berurah. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, where I gave you these examples, a storage area. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'hinei lefi zeh. According to this, l'chayra binyan, a structure, sha'oisen lahachnish sham tfua, that was built as a storage area for grain, sha'ares chayros, or other kinds of merchandise. Shekairin magazine, which was called a magazine. Imhu yoisemi beis hasayim, if it's larger than a beis hasayim, dinoi kekarpef, it becomes a karpef. What does he mean, dinoi kekarpef? The halachas that we learned earlier about a karpef shaloi hukaf ledira. Essentially, the Mechaber is really reiterating, to a certain extent, those halachas, the halachas of a karpef shaloi hukaf ledira. What's a karpef shaloi hukaf ledira? It's a storage area in its most basic form. It's a storage area outside the town limits that was enclosed with proper mechitzas, but it was enclosed in order to store firewood. It's not hukaf ledira. Since it's not hukaf ledira, once you exceed a beis hasayim, you're not allowed to be metaltal inside that karpef. Says the Mechaber over here, what's an example of an area that's mukaf mechitzos, but it's not ledira? An area that's lishmar mashe yitnu b'seicha. Says the biur halacha over here that this applies to a binyan as well. And if we go back earlier, when we learned this, we had a Mishnah Berurah there that said, even if it's makura, even if it has a roof over it. So you know what that means? A warehouse. Very interesting. If you have a warehouse, and some of these warehouses, drive by some of these Amazon warehouses nowadays, and see how massive these warehouses are. Hundreds of thousands of square feet. They're definitely larger than a beis hasayim. So if you have a binyan that's mukaf mechitzos, for what purpose? Lishmar mashe yitnu b'seicha, to protect what's inside it. It's there to protect all the merchandise that's in it. Well, that's not mukaf ledira. And if it's not mukaf ledira, then once you exceed a beis hasayim, you're not allowed to be metaltal yosim medalanamis inside that warehouse. So this becomes a very interesting question amongst the poskim, whether or not you would be allowed to be metaltal yosim medalanamis inside such a warehouse. they talk about other places as well. They talk about places like airports, right, which are very, very large structures, and they're mukaf mechitzas, and they're roofed over, but are they for dira? So the truth is that when it comes to airports, there are restaurants, people eat there, people do stay there, and that comes back to the warehouses as well. A lot of the warehouses, they have offices in them, and they have kitchens and kitchenettes, and some of them are open 24/7. So it's just, I'm not going to go into it right now. Maybe we'll get back to it, but it's a very, very interesting shaila. What is the status of these very, very large structures? Could some of them be really categorized as a karpev shloi hukaf ledira? Now let's go back to the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, 3 lines down, Hilkach, in the middle of the line. Hilkach, therefore, Elon, if you have a tree, now, we're talking about a tree here, I want you to imagine a weeping willow. So you have that weeping willows are sometimes very, very large trees, and the branches come off the tree, and then they drape down. And I have seen weeping willows where you could go inside through the willow branches, and you're in a very large enclosed area. What's the enclosure? Well, where the branches come off of the tree, first they go horizontal, and that's kind of forming your roof. Then the willow branches drape down, and there you have your walls. Says the Mechaber Hilkach, therefore, Elon, a tree, sha'anaf of yardim lamata, where the branches drape downwards, im einam gevayim shloisha min haaretz, if the tips of the branches, where they drape down to the ground, if they terminate within 3 tfachim of the ground, so you don't have a gap of more than the shir lavud, you don't have a gap of more than 3 tfachim between the end of the branch and the ground, the ikran b'makam shemechubarin le'ilan, and at the height where the branches hit the tree, hu gavoya asara, you have an interior height of 10 tfachim, so you can mamish, you walk in there, and you've got, the branch comes off the trunk at a level 10 tfachim off the ground, so your roof is 10 tfachim off the ground. The branches go horizontal. Mishnah Berurah is going to say they have to go horizontal for at least 4 tfachim. You have to have an area of at least 4 tfachim, that's 10 tfachim high. Then they drape downward, and the tips of the branches go within the shir lavud of the ground. Chashuv mechitza. So then the walls formed by these willow branches are valid mechitzos. Umutal ataltal bekuloi. You're allowed to go in there on Shabbos, and guess what? You're in a Rishos HaYachid. You go in there, you're mukaf mechitzos, you've got an area that's at least daled al daled, it's 10 tfachim tall, so presto, you're inside a Rishos HaYachid. V'hu, there's a caveat here, v'hu sheyamale ha'avir shebein ha'anafim be'etzim oy bekash. The Mechaber says that in order for this to work, there are 2 things that you have to do. Now, the point of both of these 2 steps are the same. What the Mechaber is worried about over here is, it's very nice that these willow branches are making mechitzos, but what's going to happen when the wind blows? When the wind blows, these mechitzos are going to be bottle and mavotel, right? The wind comes and scatters the branches all over the place. So says the Mechaber, in order for this to be valid, you need to fix these branches in place. How are you going to fix them in place? Says the Mechaber, the first thing that you have to do is you have to fill up the spaces between the branches. Now, the way the Mishnah Berurah, the way the Chavetz Chaim and the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, the way he's learning over here is, don't think that you're filling up the gaps because you have to make a solid wall. If the branches are within the shir lavud of each other, if the branches are all within 3 tfachim of each other, you already have a solid wall because of lavud. The reason you're filling up the gaps is to strengthen the wall and to create a wall that will not blow in the wind. You need to fill the gaps with wood or with straw, and then you need to tie the branches down to the ground, so that the wind will not blow them. Because if it's a mechitza that cannot withstand a ruach metzuya, a common wind, then it's not a valid mechitza. V'dafkad beisasayim. But, hearkening back to the beginning of the Siman, but this is only true if the enclosed area is less than a beisasayim. Because this certainly is not hukaf ledira, right? This is just a branch that a tree that happens to grow this way, and it created a shelter inside. But it's not hukaf ledira. It wasn't put there with the intent of anybody living there. Even if you planted the tree to create the shelter, you didn't plant the tree to create the shelter so somebody should live there. Generally speaking, you wanted it for shade, so somebody in the middle of the day could go in there and get some enjoyment out of the shade, get out of the sun. But nobody's setting up a bedroom. You're not making a master bedroom suite in there. So this is not ledira, and therefore it's only effective ad beis hasayim. Aval yoyse mi beis hasayim. But if you had, let's say, a bunch of weeping willow trees, and the branches kind of are like overlapping each other, and the way the trees are set up and the way they grew, you have the tree branches surrounding and roofing over a very large area, larger than a beis hasayim, loy, then you can't carry in there. Afilu netoy lekach. And that's true even if you used a very expensive landscape designer who figured out how to lay out all of these weeping willows so that you should have a beautiful shelter, a very large shelter in there, by virtue of the tree branches. It's still not hukaf ledira, kevin she'enai also loder b'soichai, because it wasn't made for people to live there. Ela lehistoifeif betzilai lishmar asadois, only to enjoy the shade, to lehistoifeif betzilai, to get pleasure in the shade, lishmar asadois, to watch the sadeh, or even to read a book, or to chazer Dirshu. But it's not there for dira, and therefore you're restricted to the size of a beis hasayim. So kind of, to sum up what the Mechaber just told us, yeah, a mechitza is a mechitza. You have a mechitza that's 10 tefachim tall. It's a mechitza that could withstand a ruach mitzuya. You enclose an area that's at least daled al daled. You've got a rishus hayachid. And that mechitza is going to be valid. And you're allowed to be metaltal b'soicha. But there's a restriction that once you exceed the size of a beis hasayim, it has to be hukaf ledira. And the Mechaber is telling us over here what constitutes hukaf ledira and not. Now, we spoke earlier about the question of what constitutes hukaf ledira, and over there primarily what we were discussing is what came first, the house or the enclosure. Now we're talking about more what exactly is the intent of the enclosure. If the intent of the enclosure is to protect produce, if the intent is to give some kind of basic shelter for a guard booth, or for somebody to be able to take a lunch break and eat behind it, these are not considered ledira. A storage area is not ledira, and therefore you would be restricted to a beis hasayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut and daled, talking about the weeping willows. Einam givayim shloisha, if the ends of the branches where they go down to the ground are not higher than 3 tefachim off the ground, they have a kalavud la'aretz. Since the branches end within 3 tefachim of the ground, lavud kicks in, and we don't see a gap between the tip of the branch and the ground. Ois cut and hehu gavaya, in the interior, you have to have a height of 10 tefachim. Now, the way the Mechaber described it is that you have the tree trunk, and where the branch comes out of the tree trunk, it's at least 10 tefachim off the ground. Mishnah Berurah is going to say it doesn't have to be that way. It could be that the branch comes off the trunk 4 tefachim off the ground, but then the branch grows in an upward direction, hits a peak, and then comes down again. That would also provide a height of 10 tefachim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hu gavaya, v'hu adinim ein gavayin asar tefachim b'makom shemechubaron le'ilan. Doesn't have to be that the branch comes off the trunk at a point 10 tefachim off the ground. Ela shebe'emtza gavayin asar tefachim sha'asui kekeshes. It could be that the branch is like a bow. It comes off the tree trunk 4 tefachim off the ground. It goes up and it hits 10 tefachim. Then it curves and it comes back down. That's fine. Ach, bein kach ubein tzarich liyos gamken rachav arba tefachim b'makom shegavayin asar tefachim. But the Mishnah Berurah puts in something that the Mechaber did not, and that is that it's not enough for the branch to hit a height of 10 tefachim, even for just 2 inches, and then come back down. you've got to have an area that has an interior height of 10 tefachim that's at least dalet al dalet. If you only have lateral measurements inside of dalet al dalet where you don't have a height of 10 tefachim, have a like karmelis, then it would be a karmelis. Now you're allowed to be metaltal anywhere inside this enclosure. If you have, let's say, the center area of this weeping willow enclosure, the center area is 10 tefachim tall, and it's got the lateral measurements of dalet al dalet, then, even if then it slopes down on all four sides, so that the vast majority of it doesn't have a height of 10 tvachim, you're still allowed to be metaltal anywhere inside this enclosure. Why? Very cute, going back to Shimon Vav. Why? Because the extensions, the part along the sides where it's not 10 tvachim tall, has the din of chayrei rishos hayachid. The Rishos hayachid dami, the chanal b'simin shin mem hey sif dalet. I said shin mem vav, shin mem hey sif dalet. Ois cut and zayin. The Machar said v'usha yamala, you need to fill in the gaps between the branches with wood or straw. Why? Not to close the gaps, Rabbi Isai. Hainu dal yedei amiloi mischazik hamechitza shaloi tisnadneid al yedei ruach. The reason you're doing this is to strengthen the branches so that they shouldn't blow easily in the wind. If you take a look at Sharitzia and Ice Cut and Hay, he says, if indeed there are gaps between the branches that are larger than Gimel Tvachim, that are larger than the Shir Lavud, then you would have to fill them up with other material, because then you don't have a mechitza. And you also need a second step. You need to tie the ends of the branches down to the ground. But if this enclosure is larger than a Beis Hasayim, you have some kind of monstrous weeping willow with very, very long branches, or you got your real high-end landscape designer to use a computer model and figure out how to plant the trees so that they interlock with each other, and you're going to make a massive enclosure of weeping willow branches, then if it's bigger than a Beis Hasayim, you can't be metaltal. You have to be metaltal amas. Ois cut and test, and this is true even if you indeed planted the weeping willows to create this shelter, it's still not going to help. It's still going to be a karpef shlohukaf lidira. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut and yud also ladur, because you didn't do it to create a residence. But what if you did make it l'shem dira? You went to this weeping willow and you said, you know what, my house is too hot. I want to have a nice place to sleep outdoors during the summer. So you embarked on a project and you went and you wove stuff between the weeping willow branches to make it a nice thick wall. You tied it down securely to the ground. And the whole time your kavanah was to create a residence, to create a dira. Then even if you didn't plant the tree for that purpose, if most of the mechitza now is going to be your construction materials that you wove, through the willow branches, have a mukaf ladira. Well, then it's mukaf ladira, because a roiv of the material that's making the mechitzas was done for dira purposes. The rest is bottle, and therefore now you taka have mechitzas that were done ladira. Okay, moving along to Sif Beis. Very complicated Sif. Short and sweet, but it's very longish. Remember a very basic halacha that we learned. When you have a tail in Rishos Harabim, tough labit, a tail, a mound in Rishos Harabim, and it's 10 tefachim tall, and it's dalet al dalet. What's the halacha of the top surface of that tail? It's a Rishos HaYachid. Why is it a Rishos HaYachid? Where are the mechitzas? It doesn't have mechitzas on top. Yeah, but the side mechitzas of the tail, good asik mechitza, we extend those using halacha l'moicha b'sinai. We extend them upwards, and now we say that halachically the top of the tail is mukaf mechitzas. Now, we learnt that there's an exception to that rule. What's the exception? So let's say this is the upper surface of your tail, and there's no mechitzas around here, right? But you've got mechitzas down here that are 10 tefachim high. So now we could say gorasik. But what if the way this building was built is such that the roof extends beyond the side wall of the house? Here's the side wall of the house, the index card that I'm holding up. That's the side wall of the house. The roof is cutting off the side wall of the house. Now we cannot say gorasik mechitza. Now we cannot say that halacha l'moshe b'Sinai, we extend the side walls of the tail up and have it surround the platform on top. Why? Because we said that you need mechitzos nikaros. We need mechitzos that are nicker. They're recognizable and visible to the person who's standing on the roof. Now, if the roof line goes over the wall, then when a person, I've had a handy little person here before from my toys from the previous share, but I don't know where he went. I guess he walked away. You know, you can't, these Lego minifigs are highly unpredictable. You know, you never know when they'll decide to walk off. But point being, we don't need the toy. If you have somebody standing on the edge of the roof and he looks down, he can't see over here. So when this gentleman walks to the end and he looks down, he doesn't see mechitzos. So then these mechitzos are not mechitzos nikaros. Since they're not mechitzos nikaros, we cannot use gorasik to extend them upwards. Okay, against that backdrop, let's learn an interesting halacha. Says the Mechaber, tail shegavoya chamisha. Let's say this tail is not 10 tefachim tall. It's only 5 tefachim tall. 5 tefachim tall, you don't have a mechitza that you say gorasik on. You only have a 5 tefach mechitza. Tail shegavoya chamisha v'hishlimai la'asara. But you make it 10. What does that mean, you make it 10? Says the Mechaber, sha'asa alav mechitza gavoya chamisha. You had a tail, and the side wall of the tail is only 5 tefachim tall. So you know what you did? You said, I only have 5 tefachim. You went to the top of the tail, and you built a 5 tefach tall wall on top of the tail. Well, now, when you look at this tail from the outside, what do you see? You see a 10 tefach mechitza. You see a 5 tefach mechitza, which is just the side wall of the tail. And then you see another 5 tefachim, which is a wall around the tail. So there is 10 tefachim of mechitza here. Says the Mechaber, that is effective. It makes the top of the tail a rishus hayachid. We look at it and we consider it to be mukaf mechitzas of 10 tefachim. Now, how is it mukaf mechitzas 10 tefachim? L'chora, the easy way to understand this is that you've got 5 tefachim below, you've got 5 tefachim on top, so you've got 10 tefachim. Once you have 10 tefachim, gorasik, right? So from here and upwards, we're going to extend the mechitza up, and if we're going to extend the mechitza up from here and upwards, well, that means that the top of the tail is going to be mukaf mechitzas, 10 tefachim. That's the easy way to understand this. Now, if that is the proper way to understand it, you might ask, why does the Mechaber have to tell this to me? What's the chiddush? Why is there a chiddush here? Well, the truth is that there's a Gemara in Eruvin about this, and Rav Chisda does not hold of this. Rav Chisda holds that this is not a valid mechitza. You look in the Rishonim, one of the reasons the Rishonim seem to say that Rav Chisda doesn't hold of this is because the mechitzas are not nikaros. Why are the mechitzas not nikaros? So the way the Rishonim want to say is like this. As long as the top of the tail doesn't have any mechitzas around it, and the side wall of the tail is 10 tefachim, well, in that case, you have mechitzas nikaros of 10 tefachim, because the guy standing on the edge of the roof looks down, and he sees the 10 tefach drop from the top of his tail down to the ground. So he sees that there are 10 tefach mechitzas here outside. So you have mechitzas nikaros of 10 tefachim. You could use gorasik to extend it upwards. But when you only have 5 below, and then you have 5 on top, you don't have mechitzas nikaros anymore. You know why? Because the 5 tefach short little wall at the edge of the roof could prevent the fellow from walking to the side of the roof, looking over and seeing the 5 tefach mechitza below. So now you have no mechitzas nikaris of 10 tefachim, and now you can't say gorasik. That's one shot in Reb Chisda. We paskin, not like Reb Chisda, but very clearly, the Mechaber says over here that this 5 and 5 does work. Tel shegavay chamisha v'shlima la'asara she'asa la mechitza gavay chamisha chashuva mechitza. It's a valid mechitza l'taltal. You could be metaltal on top of that tail, ulechol davar, and it's a valid mechitza for everything. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, tel shegavay chamisha tefachim in the aretz. You have a tail, it's elevated 5 tefachim off the ground. V'uadin chritz, the same thing would apply to a ditch. Sha'amoy chamisha tefachim, where you have a ditch that's 5 tefachim deep, v'asa sfasa charitz mechitza gavay chamisha, and then above ground you make a 5 tefach mechitza. Now that case is easier to understand, right? Because if you have a 5 tefach deep ditch, right, and now somebody goes down into that ditch, he's mukaf mechitza, he's a 5 tefachim, right? Now if you make a 5 tefach fence on the surface, on the edge going around the top of that ditch, the guy who's inside, yeah, he's mukaf mechitzas of 10 tefachim. So this is very easy to understand. Our case of the tail, the person that's standing on top of the tail is only surrounded by 5 tefach mechitzas. He's only surrounded by a 5 tefach fence. The other 5 tefachim are the outside walls of the tail. So that's a bigger chiddush. Mitzdarfen leichasha mechitza shel 10 tefachim. Aizkan yud beisha asa alav hainu al sfas hatel. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, realize that the fence that you're making around the perimeter of the tail has to be on the edge. It has to be on the edge. And I think it has to be on the edge for more than one reason. It has to be on the edge because it has to be able to connect to the 5, if this is the 5 tefach outside wall of the tail, and you bring your fence on top of the tail inboard, more than 3 tefachim, that's more than the sheer limud. Now this and this are somehow not connected. And here you can't say gorasik because you only have 5 tefachim. So where's your gorasik? You're not going to have gorasik. You have 5 tefach over here. You have 5 tefach over here. 10 tefachim you don't have. This is effective l'taltal. The toicha mechitza is mechashev k'rishus hayachid gamur sheyehem mutal l'taltal b'soicha. The top of the tail becomes a bona fide rishus hayachid. Oiskan tesvav. It's a mechitza to be matir tiltal. Oiskan tesvav ulechol davar, and it's a valid mechitza for any other purpose. What are the other purposes? Hainu gam le'inyan hefsik shtei chatzeros k'muvur l'kamon Siman Shinayin Beis Sivav. In Siman Shinayin Beis, we're going to have some complicated scenarios of different chatzerim that are next to each other. And we need to know the status of these chatzerim. Are they considered one chatzer, so that they're considered connected to each other? Are they considered 2 different chatzeros, so they're not connected to each other? And that's going to make all the difference in the world when it comes to the halachas of eruve chatzeros. So we're going to have cases where we have one chatzer down below, another chatzer elevated above it and to the side. Are they considered one? Are they not? Do we have a mechitza between them or not? This halacha over here, that you could be mitzdarif 5 tefachim on the outside of an elevation with a 5 tefach mechitza on top of that elevation, is going to come into play over there as well. We're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Gimel. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasset sheduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu amen. Be well.